This will be an example of a CrossFit athlete that sustained a hip flexion sensitivity issue that we will kind of go through as far as using the envelope of function and like how we progress them through that. So let's get started. Our athlete was initially injured doing a Zercher squat, which is being shown here. This was one component of his CrossFit training regimen on that day. He was going to the box 5 times per week. This was the initial incident that he noticed his pain with, but he had been doing kind of a combination workout at that point. But now he has problems doing this, and this is a fairly common component of his training regimen, his CrossFit box. Ultimately, we want to get him back to this type of an activity, and this is one of his major goals. We need to find an entry point, determine when he's adapted, increase his load, determine when he's adapted, and continue to increase his load. We need to figure out what his initial load needs to be. We need to figure out how he's adapted. And then we need to figure out, okay, how do we progress it and or regress it? And he wants to train 5 days a week. So we can't constantly be increasing his load. How do we stay with a consistent frequency? How do we continue to adapt his load to stay in overload without getting up into here? So just a quick reminder, here is our frequency. Here is our load. These are going to be days of the week. These are going to be relatively arbitrary numbers. Our athlete was training 5 days per week. His arbitrary load was here, and we'll talk about like how you can calculate arbitrary load. And he was doing fine with this. So this was in his overload, but you can see it's kind of getting to the point where it's really pushing him. So like his rate of perceived exertion was very high here. And then when he was injured, he was training 5 days a week. It ends up being a load type of mechanism for injury. Zercher squat, the load was higher than usual. And so like I'm not going to use numbers because then I'll just kind of mess up all my math. But essentially his load was X here and Y load is what got him into trouble. So the easy thing to do would be going back down to X load. But remember now he's injured, has his envelope shifted down this way. And there's ways that we can figure that out, but an easy thing to do would be simply, okay, when he's doing Zercher squats, is to bring it back down to here. He also has hip flexion sensitivity. Not just only Zercher squat hurts, but anything that requires him to get into a certain amount of hip flexion with a certain amount of load is what causes him problems. That is the issue. It's not, and this will oftentimes be an issue with athletes, is there's a certain activity that bothers them or set their symptoms off, or a magnitude or a frequency or a certain direction. But now, like in this athlete's case, is what gets him up into here is hip flexion at a certain amount of range of motion, especially with load. So he can go into more hip flexion unloaded than he can go loaded. So like weight bearing, for example. This is one example of many. And I oftentimes use a quote, and I forget. I think it was, honestly, I'm going to forget. I'll try to look it up and put it on here. But there are a quote that kind of goes across is principles are few, methods are many. What that means is what are the principles you want to follow to get this person to be back to their activities? So there should only be a few principles. Meaning in this case, we want to be able for him to tolerate hip flexion in a loaded position and, with gradually increasing his load over a period of time. And we want him to kind of like monitor that on his own. So therefore the methods are many. Like you can do multiple ways to get him to increase his sensitivity to hip flexion in a non-loaded and then loaded and then increased weight over a period of time. There are a ton of possibilities. Now I'm just going to give you a few. So principles are few. Stick to your principles. What are your principles? I want him to eventually, I want him to tolerate range of motion. I initially want him to tolerate increased hip flexion in a non-weight bearing position. I eventually want to get to more load, to an upright position, and to tolerate hip flexion in progressive ranges of motion with progressive loads. So my principles are essentially is very minimal. Is I want him to be able to tolerate Zercher squats with X amount of load, Y frequency, but like I have to step progression that. My methods to get there are going to be multiple. This is what we did with him. This is what worked. I found an entry point. I figured out he adapted. I increase the load and then increase the load or maybe I do all three of these things within a week. Remember, he's training 5 days per week. I might have a heavy day, I might have a light day, and I might have a medium day. So I want him to stay at the box. I mean, it's very, CrossFitters want to CrossFit. Runners want to run. You want to, the great thing about CrossFit and running is people are very motivated. And sometimes that's kind of the opposite issue is where you have to kind of like hold them back. So you still want him to go to the box. You want to talk to him about, hey, this is your program. I don't want you to deviate out of it because he's going to see his friends doing things that were initially provoking him. You want him to scale that back and control that. So you want him to still get his workout in, but with, a scaled back version of those types of things. So you want to teach him how to do load monitoring, external and internal, and I'll get into more of that, so weights times reps, and then also things like RPE and that type of stuff. And perhaps even, do you want him to get deep into it as far as calculating arbitrary units? He's a CrossFit person. A runner would do the same thing. You could do the same thing, but if you got somebody that's coming in, you simply want them to get 150 minutes of activity per week, you're probably not going to spend your time teaching them how to calculate arbitrary units. And so it depends on the level of your person. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to have him do battle ropes. It's going to kind of talk through the different variables here. So the frequency is I'm not going to change frequency at all. Frequency is going to stay consistent at 5 days per week. I'm not changing that. What I'm modulating, my variables that I'm manipulating are going to be range of motion of his hip and then also load. So range of motion, unloaded, non-weight bearing, weight bearing, amount of range of motion, and then the amount of load, the weight that he's doing. So two variables are range of motion of the hip and then the load that he's imparting or holding. So in this case, simply modulating or manipulating range of motion. I have him go to a position. I want to have you squat down. I want you to go to where you just start having pain. Then I want you to come up like 3 or 4 inches. And you say, okay, and you have him stay there for maybe 10, 20 seconds. Are you okay in that position? Yep, I have no pain. All right, so that's your position. You're going into a position where he doesn't have, so this is first entry point, first exercise. You find a point where he doesn't have pain, and you just sustain the load. You have him work his tail off in that position. So the rate limiting factor probably is going to be his arms. And so you can kind of play with, maybe you do different battle ropes, maybe you do a different exercise, something that doesn't tax his arms as much, but you're trying to get him to tolerate a sustained position. If he does okay with this, and so I'm going to give you a ton of options here. If he does okay with this, is maybe you have him squat into and out of it as he's doing these battle ropes. So maybe he's doing both arms and both arms at the same time and swinging it as he goes upright and then down. So you're adding movement and versus a sustained position. Well, let's just say he stays at this. All right, then the next exercise is you figure, okay, he's fine with sustained. Now I want him to go into and out of the motion like we talked about just a minute ago, and we're going to give him some load. So he's going to increase his moment arm as he comes up to here, but he's in hip extension. And so the weight, the kettlebell is going to drive him into hip flexion. And you might even go to where, hey, I want you to go stay out of the painful range. He does okay with that over time. And then eventually, over a couple of visits, you say, okay, now I want you to go to where you're just kind of like touching the pain. Keep the pain level between, no higher than a 4. A progression from here is now you're getting dynamic movement. And you're getting dynamic movement. You're getting into potentially more or less hip range of motion. So I could go for initially, let's say he had 60 degrees of hip flexion. Maybe I keep him at 50 here. Because I've changed it from static to dynamic. So if I'm going to go to dynamic, is that then I want to back the range of motion off. If you change one variable, oftentimes you want to scale back another variable. You don't want to keep adding two variables. Like I don't want to go from static to dynamic with 60 degrees of hip flexion to 90. Like I'm adding too many things. I'm going from static to dynamic, and I'm going from less range of motion to more range of motion. So I might go from static to dynamic, but less range of motion. Or, maybe it's just stay out of pain. But then my progression from here might be, time, how, weight of the kettlebell, and or going into or out of pain. So maybe I first initially have him do it with a 10-pound kettlebell, and I have him stay out of the pain-free range of motion, and we go for a certain amount of time in reps. And then so we keep the next progression could be keeping the kettlebell the same weight, keeping the range of motion the same, and just increasing his volume. And another progression, a different progression could be, so you can manipulate volume, you can manipulate hip range of motion, you can manipulate the load. And so I'm probably going to manipulate volume first and then manipulate load. And then another thing that I could do is, I went from static to dynamic, but I controlled, I didn't really get into range of motion that he was having problems with. And he needs to get because one of the things that they do is rowing ergometer. And he's going to have to do this as an exercise, and that's bothering him now. So now I want to go from weight bearing upright, dynamic, to now, let's get off of weight bearing and let's get to where he's not got body weight on there. But now, so we decreased one variable, but now we're increasing the variable of range of motion. And so now you're going much deeper into hip flexion, way deeper than he was here or here. And it's dynamic like this was, but it's non-weight bearing. So it's not comparting load through the hip from a weight bearing standpoint. It's a range of motion sensitivity. So your variables that you're going to manipulate are load, range of motion, and then potentially load with range of motion. Frequency is going to be held, I'm not changing how often he's training. I'm keeping that constant. And I'm changing load, so load from a standpoint of static load, dynamic load, dynamic with non-weight bearing. And, the load could be free, volume here, and volume here. There's so many things that you can change here. And you just want to consider is, what are my principles? Eventually my principles are for him to be weight bearing with weight up in the front and going into hip flexion. But I'm trying to get hip flexion in different means. I'm trying to get it statically, dynamically with controlled range of motion, dynamically with much higher range of motion, but it's non-weight bearing. So these are all the different variables you're gonna play with. And eventually I want to get range of motion with load, right? But I want to manipulate load by itself, range of motion by itself. If I increase the load, I'm probably going to decrease the range of motion. So in this case, I increase from here to here, I increase the range of motion, but I'm decreasing the load with the ergometer by not having him be weight bearing, which the task kind of takes care of itself. And so maybe I go, and the other thing I could manipulate here is maybe he was going for, reps and sets and, duration. Maybe he was going for, in this case, let's say 10 minutes. But now I'm scaling it back to 5 minutes because I'm doing more range of motion. And if he does okay with that, then I'm going to keep the range of motion the same and maybe go to 7.5 minutes. Keep the range of motion the same and go, eventually get back up to 10 minutes. So I'm holding the range of motion consistent and I'm increasing the duration. So you want to play with these things, but you don't want to keep increasing both of them at the same time. And let's say in this case, you wanted to do the range of motion, but he doesn't really, that was too much. Or, you notice that he was getting, and let's say it's just his left hip only. And say you want to bias that left leg. So you might have him do something like this, where you put him, he's not weight bearing, and or maybe he was sensitive with that. There's maybe you want to scale it back and or increase the range of motion, and or you just simply want to go that one leg. So I could do something like this shuttle, or I could still do where I'm doing this, not really pulling and just doing the one leg on here. But now you can see like he has much more range of motion here compared to the shuttle, but you're doing it single, so you have a little bit more load here because you're doing it single leg. And now I can play with the range of motion here. I can bring this down so it's so the shuttle is closer to here. I can change his foot, so especially if it's like a knee, I can bring his foot down here, which will give him more knee flexion and a little bit more hip flexion. And I can add the weight on here. So there's all kinds of variables I can change with that as well. So just kind of consider all these different things that I was doing. One thing I can do, so I wanted to go 5 days per week. It might be, how I get here is going to be variable. It might be 1 day a week, and I'm probably going to have like a heavy day, a light day, a medium day, which gives me 3 days a week, and then maybe I'm going heavy and light again. Heavy, light, medium, 3 days, heavy, and light. That's 5 days. Maybe my light days are just doing like the shuttle. Maybe my heavy days are doing all three of those things. So maybe I'm doing all three of these things, and so that's heavy in the standpoint of volume and perhaps load, but like I'm doing all three of these things in one session. And maybe my light day is I'm only doing like one of these. And so if I'm only doing one, it might just be a range of motion emphasis. So it might be either doing the ergometer and or the shuttle, and or maybe early on it might just be, hey, he's really flexion sensitive, stay out of range of motion. My point is you're going to play with all this. Sometimes you're going to be, so my light day, I'm probably going to be down here. My heavy day, let's say it's day 2 or 3, like I'm going to probably be close to here. And so this constant going back and forth is overall my mean is going to be here. And how you figure that out is you look at things like we talked about before, is how much range of motion is he tolerating? Is he getting any swelling, which is going to be hard to tell in the hip? Does it feel stiffer? Is he losing range of motion? And then also things like RPE, so internal rating of perceived exertion.